NASA does not talk about the radiation like they should, but going to Mars and back will undoubtedly make you astronomically more likely to get many types of cancers.
If you could just kind of tell me a little bit about how you came to research what you research today and the sort of paths that led you down there, because people know you as a ketosis researcher, but obviously you've gone far beyond that. So just, yeah, a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and yeah, we'll kick off from there.
Yeah, well, my academic interests were really kind of spawned by my personal interests. And in my undergrad was nutrition, and I was very much interested in nutrition because of probably, to be honest, like body composition alterations, and my interest in fitness led me to nutrition. And as my academic career started to evolve, I realized that the brain was really in the 1990s, it was like the decade of the brain. So I kind of redirected my focus on neuroscience and physiology. And my mentor at the time was studying the neural control of autonomic regulation, how the brain controls our physiology. And in the process of doing that, we were looking at physiology under extreme environments, including hypoxia, what happens in the brain during hypoxia. And I did a lot of research on the brainstem mechanisms associated with physiological control under hypoxic conditions and, extreme conditions. And I got very interested into diving and diving physiology, and that led me to do a postdoctoral fellowship that was funded by the Navy to understand and to mitigate oxygen toxicity seizures, which is a limitation for Navy SEAL divers, but also a limitation for hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which is used for 14 different FDA approved applications.
Yeah.
And so my research was really very fundamental, like studying cells in a dish to animal models to, individual mitochondria. And then it has evolved to doing, clinical trial research on subjects, and then further evolved to actually me being a subject in a NASA space analog mission, which was NASA has a lot of funny acronyms. This is
Yeah.
called NASA's Extreme Environment Mission Operations, or NEMO. And that was an amazing experience to live with and train with astronauts who are, some of them are bound to go to Mars, but they have been on the space station, and to be just part of their astronaut training, to be a neuroscientist and a physiologist that could actually do research to understand in these extreme environments, working with government
But
organizations. So, yeah,
yeah, I mean,
it's
that's
been
an
a
amazing,
fun. Yeah,
and you must have learned so much from that. I mean, how many people have done
yeah.
anything like that, right? Not that many. So
Yeah, it's an amazing opportunity, and I never thought it would take me down that path. But I think my skill set in diving, like advanced dive training, and also my academic background in neuroscience and also my wife too, because my wife was a dive master. She's got a PhD in neuroscience,
wow.
and then when you go on this mission, you need to have people behind you in mission control. And my wife is very good operationally, so she handled like 6 different IRB protocols on physiological research, like something that I could never do. So
Impressive.
she
Yeah.
she allowed me to actually bring in a massive amount of research that was conducted on this mission. And then she impressed NASA so much that she was recruited in Nemo 23, which was an all-female mission. So we worked with NASA on 2 different space analog missions. And I think that was largely possible just because, my expertise, but really my wife's expertise opened up our ability to actually do research on it. Because it's one thing to be an aquanaut to train with them, but it's another thing to be someone who's actually doing the research. That's like a whole nother skill set and paperwork and just, IRB approvals and things like that. So it was an amazing experience to take my basic science research and have that evolve through animal research and then apply that to human factors or operational research.
And I mean, it's pretty cool and consequential in that this could eventually help people, as you said, going into space, but potentially going to Mars, right? So some of the
Yeah,
research that we're doing would provide information for future missions, presumably.
Yeah, and I don't want to make it sound like it's all of our research. We did pack a lot of research into that, but the main thing is actually for NASA to train on procedures, to train on different devices that they're using, and to really train the astronauts to basically function as a crew in a very confined habitat that's under the water in an extreme environment. Like you can't pop up to the top
Yeah.
because you have to do like a 17-hour stage decompression. So
Decompression.
it
Yeah.
is very much like an extreme environment. You live and work at several atmospheres of pressure, and you do what's called an extravehicular activity or EVAs and things like that. And you follow the same timeline, use the same apps, the same procedures. All the protocols are very similar to living in space. So that was just like an amazing opportunity in and of itself. But what you learn, and also just being among astronauts who are just so sharp in what they do and such amazing humans, and I was able to also bring my students and my research associates down to Isla Morada and then actually to bring my lab at the University of South Florida to take my students and make them part of it. And that was an amazing experience to do that.
Yeah. I mean, and so what were the sort of main kind of lessons you were able to learn, or the information? What did that kind of allow you to gather from that?
Yeah, we looked at so many different things. Some of it's published, a lot of it's not published yet, but we looked at we looked at strength. We did like, grip strength. We looked at body composition changes. We looked at physiological changes like in blood flow. We looked at sleep. We used the Aura rings to look at how sleep changes in extreme environments. We did heart rate variability. We did Man, we looked at so many different things, and
Yeah.
some of it's published and some of it's not, so I can't talk too much about it. But
I
things like
see.
how taste changes in these environments. I looked at the CO2 levels. We looked at cardiometabolic markers, how things like inflammatory markers change in extreme environments, how hormones change, how your metabolism changes. A lot of different, and also my wife is a behavioral neuroscientist, so she studied cognition, reaction time, decision making, and there's a variety of tests that we can use for that. The NIH toolbox, and then NASA has, their own tests for that.
Yeah.
So we would do these tests like when we wake up to look at like our cognitive function and reaction time. And of course, astronauts are like off the scale, right? That's why they're astronauts. So you're
Yeah.
like, when the data comes in, it's like everything's blinded. So I'm wondering like, wow, how do I compare to the astronauts? But they're just like amazing. We had a mini DNA analyzer and sequencer, so we looked at the microbiomes of our skin, of our gut. We got astronaut poop in our -80-degree freezer. We haven't even analyzed yet since we collected that over several missions. Uh, Man, we did, like I said, it was like 6 IRB protocols of research, and a lot of it we haven't even published yet. Some of it we have, most of it we've analyzed, but we're still writing it up. But the crew is 4 crew members and then 2 habitat techs. So it's like you got 6 people on 2 different missions. And so the sample size is relatively small, but the quality of research that you do on these missions is very good, especially working with NASA. Their professionalism and their operating procedures and things like that make it surprisingly easy to conduct, physiological research. Little bit. I mean, there's a lot of paperwork and protocols you have to follow, but you can get some really great data in these extreme environments.
I can imagine. I mean, especially
Yeah.
with NASA, you're dealing with the kind of top of the top, right? In terms of intelligence and in terms of protocols, you'd imagine if they're sending people into space, that's sort of thing
Yeah.
that requires a lot of careful planning and attention to detail.
Yeah.
So I appreciate there's certain things that you may not be able to talk about relating to that, but are there any kind of takeaways for how you do things, in a less extreme environment, like here on
Mhm.
Earth, in your sort of day to day, any kind of takeaways from that mission or that you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. So we, in regards to eating and our personal time, like we had the liberty to have flexibility on that. Like we didn't have to eat according to what NASA was telling us, although they gave us space food, right? So I was on a ketogenic diet. The idea was to everyone follow their normal diet. So for me, that was a ketogenic diet. And also I was eating probably just like 2 meals per day instead of like, 3 or 4 meals and snacks and things like that. Uh, and I also being in a state of physiological ketosis, I think gives advantages in that environment in regards to you don't get hungry, you can focus on your tasks and maintain cognitive function. And especially when you go outside of the habitat and you're working in the water, when you go, the dry habitat is under pressure. So when you go in the water, you're still under pressure, but you're in a wet habitat. And sometimes like you don't have access to food, so but you're tethered to, you have an umbilical cord and then you can go off and venture all around. And then there's people, support divers, that make sure your umbilical cord doesn't get tangled around in like the reef and things like that. But you're working in a very extreme environment for hours and hours, and even though the water's like in the 80s, you tend to get like hypothermia
Okay.
towards the end, and you'll shake and things like that. So I think from, my perspective, some of the things that I learned that could be useful to people is really just, I mean, working with a team and having a plan. I mean, NASA is all about planning. They have a particular app that they use that has a red line. Everybody's tasks are actually listed in the software app that you have on your phone, and they do have internet under the water because the cable's under. So you
Yeah.
have access to this, and it's like a real time um, like chart and organization of all the tasks that you have to do. And it's amazing how you're elevated when you're pressured by this red line, moving across, chronologically. And you got to get your task done, because if you don't, for example, the first task that I had to do was use a mini DNA analyzer and sequencer to
Yeah.
sequence the microbiome of the habitat. And my mini DNA analyzer broke, so they had to ship another one down to me, and it had 58 pages of instructions on how to use it.
Wow.
So I'm already behind. I had like 4 hours to do this, and I'm already like 1 or 2 hours behind. They had to ship another, they had to have a diver come down and give me another one. So I'm already behind. And then Shell Lindgren, who is my commander, NASA astronaut, also a medical doctor, was following right up on me. So I was delaying his experiments coming after me. So that immediately put me into a high level of stress,
Yeah.
and I'm measuring my hormone levels and also my cortisol. And I do this routinely because, I like to, measure my hormones and things like that. And my cortisol is always like on the low end of normal. And during this mission, during this particular, that first day, it was like 3 or 4 times higher and even elevated the next day. So
Yeah.
it just goes to show you that if you're prepared for that, like NASA astronauts are prepared, so they just calmly go into it and they flexecute, they call it. And
That's
they
a
don't even
great
have like
phrase.
they don't
Yeah.
even have
Great
like
word.
a stress response to that, because
Wow.
they're trained for that. Whereas I'm, I was less trained for a major malfunction like that. I was very concerned that I was delaying everybody else's experiments. And I was thinking maybe I broke this thing, maybe I turned it on in a different sequence of things, and a lot of things were running through my head. Uh, but yeah, I just think, there's a lot of psychological things that you garner from working with this team, and they call it, my wife calls it, she's an expert in this, team cognition.
Yeah.
So how groups of teams work together, there's researchers that study this, and they actually will capture all the audio of teams communicating and working together, and even like the tones of voice and like the phrases that they use can all be put into algorithms to determine the cognitive and physiological and psychological state of the
Yeah.
team. And then that gives like an index to, like a team cognition index. And if you can gather this information and it goes back to knowledgeable people, they could determine if the team is starting to break apart, mentally, and then they can give, kind of course correct as you go. So it's a lot of science that's above my head. Even though I'm a neuroscientist, I'm not a behavioral neuroscientist like my wife and some of the experts on this team. But it's pretty interesting how you can mine the data in different ways to really, and then give actionable feedback to the team. And this is done in special operations community too, in the military. So it's highly relevant to the other area of research that I do, which is Office of Navy Research on, I'm in the warfighter performance department. So it
That's a
has
pretty
high
cool department.
relevance.
Yeah.
Yeah, Code 34. So it's like, yeah, I've been funded working with them for over 20 years
Wow.
on different things like basically ways to detect oxygen toxicity or different how our physiology changes in extreme environments, and then be able to mitigate and enhance safety, performance, and resilience in those environments. But it has direct correlations with NASA. We've even had blue sky missions where we bring NASA program managers and then Navy program managers together because there's so much overlap. Actually, it was that blue sky mission that I met the Bill Todd, who actually runs NASA Nemo, and I got the invitation through some of these meetings that brought the Navy and NASA together so they can learn from each other. So yeah, I think it's really important to not put yourself into silos and for organizations to work together because there's a lot of overlap in the knowledge that you can garner from different things.
Absolutely. And I think it says a lot about them, the fact that they're open to kind of learning from different,
Yeah.
obviously very kind of high level people, but different areas of expertise. And
Yeah.
as you said,
It's
that
kind of unprecedented. And, when you're in a submarine and you're living under the water for months in a confined habitat, now a submarine is at 1 atmosphere, so it's not like an extreme environment. Like we lived in a pressurized habitat under the water. But from a psychological standpoint, from a team cognition standpoint, what the Navy does when putting guys into like submarines and stuff and the operational procedures, there's high relevance to, ISS, the International Space Station, or a deep sea space mission where you're sending guys in a confined habitat for months or years. High relevance, high amount of overlap in the type of research that you could do there.
absolutely. And I think also overlap in terms of some of the things you were talking about, functioning at a high level for long periods
Yes.
without these sort of ebbs and flows in concentration and swings in energy and all that sort of stuff. And
Yeah. Yep.
the potential applicability of something like ketosis or exogenous ketones and that sort of thing. So
Exactly. Yeah.
that's fascinating stuff. I've never spoken to is it an aquanaut? Is that the phrase?
Yeah, an aquanaut is a term used for people who have been underwater for more than 24 hours.
So that's
And
you, right?
yeah, I
Yeah.
was down for 10 days underwater, and it was very like intense 10 days where you do so much research within that 10 days worth of time. Yeah, so the first 24 hours you become an aquanaut. I have like some kind of aquanaut certification. And then
Yeah.
to be an aquanaut, to work in that environment, you have to use like a specialized equipment. It's not like you don't, it's not you're not breathing through a regulator. You have a helmet, super light helmet, one of the best, helmets for training that. And then you have communications too.
Yeah.
So so the helmet has, communication. So you're communicating with the other people that you're diving with. So you have that level, and but you're also communicating with mission control, who's giving you
Right.
directions on various procedures to do. For example, we would go out to special like different types of coral that were endangered. I think Ciderastria, like I had and a couple other different types of coral where I would have to drill in and get a sample of the coral and bring it back, and then you do like a genetic ID of the coral. And
Oh,
then you
wow.
also take samples of the coral and then you put it on different cards. And then you take the cards out to like a coral nursery so you can propagate that and this is a coral reef project. So some of the things they task us with different procedures to do where we go out, like on Mars, you would go out and find a rock, right? And you would bring it back and analyze it. So what we had to do, I mean, there's rocks undersea, but we would take coral and then our missions were to like, bring that back, idea, and then develop these nurseries where you can propagate this endangered species of coral. So you're actually doing, it's not just like NASA training and testing procedures. You're actually working with different foundations and organizations to do like environmental work, to vet out and test various technologies that are new. And some of the technologies and equipment then go on to the space station, and things that work and things fail, and then you get other devices for the next mission.
That must be very rewarding though, seeing this sort of, it's a pretty major contribution then. That's pretty cool
Yeah.
to think about, as you said, all those sorts of you wouldn't necessarily think of, you'd think about it being quite a discrete project, but the fact that it has all this kind of overarching impact and overarching other elements to it is that's really interesting.
Yeah, they partner with, well, there's a lot of people trying to get their research product, their technology, and even foundations trying to get, their agenda, if you will. It's not the right term, but to get their mission into the mission,
Yeah,
really. And it helps promote them, and it's great collaboration. And I think there's a lot of overlap that you could be living and working underwater or in space and actually do. And that's what they do on the ISS. I'm working with Dr. Marshall Porterfield, who headed all the life sciences there. And a lot of what he did, a lot of what he funded in NASA was like very basic fundamental knowledge of biological systems in space. Like when you're in space, if you're in space on the space station and you're confined to a room and you're breathing, there's no convection in space because there's no gravity. So you will build a CO2 bubble and then you'll die. If you light a candle in space, like the candle has a characteristic flame,
would be round.
but yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So you'll have the flame will be round and it'll suck up all the oxygen and then it'll go out. Like you can't keep it. So you have to like, there has to be like a laminar flow and specialized systems for, the air and things like that. But that has major, major implications for human health, safety, and performance that you're building the CO2 bubble. So there's no convection. So there's no convection. You build a heat plume, so the heat does not rise either. So the heat builds, but there's no heat that rises. This has major implications from a fundamental standpoint because the same thing happens on a nanoscopic scale at the level of the atom. So even in a fluid medium, there's lack of convection and heat, and that has major implications for some of the real sciencey stuff. I mean, we don't have time to go into it, but the lack of convection not only happens at the level of the candle, but it happens at the level of the atom. And that has major implications for mitochondrial function and oxidative stress and things that I study. So that's
Yeah.
a big part of what I'm kind of researching now and developing different protocols and different experiments to understand what this lack of convection, the implications for that, and how to study it. And because it's going to be extremely important for these long duration space, we don't think about like convection, that we're sitting here and the heat is rising. That's why we can breathe and the heat is carrying the CO2 and things like that. But this does not happen in space. So it has major safety implications. And it's
I
not
can,
talked about too much either,
no, I can
as much as
imagine.
it should be, but it's probably one of the most important things in space, along with something called GCR radiation, galactic cosmic radiation, which is like charged particles that fly through you like little nano guns shooting right through your body. You don't feel it, but it's breaking your DNA. You get double-stranded nicks, so you get DNA mutations. So you're much more likely.
Wow.
So NASA does not talk about the radiation like they should, but going to Mars and back will undoubtedly make you astronomically more likely to get many types of cancers, all types of cancer. So this is not talked about a lot, but it's
No.
part of various meetings and workshops. Like how do we mitigate this? How do we create
But yeah,
shielding, create biological countermeasures against space radiation? So that's a big part of what I think about and what I do to basically enhance our body's ability to repair DNA through enhancing epigenetic mechanisms and biological mechanisms that will enhance longevity, enhance performance, enhance our resilience against these extreme space environments.